The thunder rolled across the Wyoming territory like a warning as Eliza Fairfield slipped from the train, her feet touching the dust of Silver Creek for the first time since she'd fled 3 years prior. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the August heat of 1873, a habit born not of cold, but of the need to hide what lay beneath the fabric scars that told stories she preferred to keep untold. The small frontier town hadn't changed much. The same weathered buildings lined the main street. The same saloons still bustled with rowdy cowboys fresh from the trail, and the same mountains loomed in the distance, purple and imposing against the fading daylight. What had changed was Eliza herself, no longer the bright-eyed 19-year-old who'd left with dreams of becoming a schoolteacher back east. She adjusted her carpetbag and started down the main street, aware of the curious glances from townspeople who didn't quite recognize the woman who'd once been the doctor's cheerful daughter. Her father's practice stood at the end of the street, a modest building with peeling white paint. It had been closed since his death 6 months ago. The letter informing her had taken months to find her in Boston. "Miss Fairfield?" A voice called, stopping her in her tracks. She turned to see Sheriff Wilson, older now with more gray in his mustache. "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a nod. "Heard you might be returning. Sorry about your father. He was a good man." "Thank you," she said simply, not trusting her voice with more. "Town's been without a doctor since. Folks have to ride all the way to Cheyenne now." Eliza nodded again. "I know. That's partly why I've returned. I've been studying medicine in Boston." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Well, that's good news indeed. Your father would be proud." She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope so." As they spoke, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider approached at a steady trot, his silhouette cutting a striking figure against the sunset. The horse, a magnificent buckskin, snorted as the rider pulled it to a stop near them. "Evening, Sheriff," the rider said, his voice deep and smooth like whiskey. He tipped his hat, revealing a face that was handsome despite the thin scar that ran along his jawline. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, landed on Eliza with unmistakable interest. "Vaughn," the sheriff nodded. "This here is Miss Eliza Fairfield, Doc Fairfield's daughter. She's returned to take over her father's practice." The man Vaughn swung down from his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. He removed his hat completely, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Vaughn Thornton, madam," he introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "I run the Triple T Ranch just outside of town." Eliza hesitated before offering her gloved hand, which he took gently. "Mr. Thornton, just Vaughn, please." His eyes studied her face, and she fought the urge to look away. There was something in his gaze, not pity, which she'd grown to despise, but a quiet understanding that unsettled her. "Vaughn's been helping look after your father's property," the sheriff explained. "Keeping the looters away and such." "That's very kind of you," Eliza said, carefully withdrawing her hand. "Least I could do. Your father set my broken leg once when I was thrown from a wild Mustang. Never took a cent for it when he knew I was just starting my ranch." A gust of wind caught Eliza's shawl, momentarily pulling it from her shoulder before she could catch it. She was quick, but not quick enough to hide the jagged scar that ran from her collarbone down beneath her high-neck dress. Vaughn's eyes flickered to it, then back to her face without comment, but she'd seen the question there. "I should get settled in," she said, eager to escape the conversation. "It's been a long journey." "Of course," Vaughn said. "Would you allow me to escort you to your father's house? I have the keys the sheriff entrusted to me." Before she could decline, the sheriff interjected, "That's a fine idea. It's getting dark, and the place has been closed up for months." Eliza wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage alone as she had for years now, but practicality won out. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. That would be helpful." Vaughn took her carpetbag despite her protests and led his horse by the reins as they walked toward the modest house behind her father's practice. They walked in silence for a moment, the only sounds the creak of his saddle, the soft thud of the horse's hooves, and the distant piano from the saloon. "I was sorry to hear about your father," Vaughn finally said. "He was well respected in these parts." "Yes, he was dedicated to this town," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I hope to continue his work. It's needed. We lost 3 men this spring, 2 from infection after injuries, 1 from fever." Might have been different if a doctor had been close. Guilt pricked at her conscience. She'd been away, pursuing her own dreams, when her father had grown ill. When the people here had needed help, they reached the small house, and Vaughn tied his horse to the hitching post before retrieving a key from his pocket. The door creaked open, revealing a home suspended in time. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but otherwise, it was exactly as she remembered her father's books on the shelves, his pipe on the side table, his spectacles folded neatly beside a half-read medical journal. Emotion threatened to overwhelm her, but she swallowed it down. "Thank you for looking after things," she managed. Vaughn set her bag down and moved to light the oil lamp on the table. The warm glow illuminated the room and cast soft shadows across his features. "I'll get a fire going for you," he said, moving toward the hearth. "That's not necessary. I'm sure you need to get back to your ranch." He paused, studying her with those perceptive eyes. "The ranch can wait. It's getting cold, and you've had a long journey." Before she could argue further, he was already kneeling at the hearth, arranging kindling. His movements were efficient, practiced. Within minutes, a small fire danced in the fireplace, casting the room in warm light. "There's food in the cellar," he said, standing and dusting off his hands. "Nothing fancy, but enough to get you through tonight. I asked Mrs. Peterson at the general store to stock some provisions when we heard you were coming back." The thoughtfulness of this stranger caught her off guard. "That's very kind. It's what neighbors do." He put his hat back on and headed for the door. "I'll leave you to get settled, but if you need anything, the Triple T is just 3 miles north. Anyone in town can point the way." Eliza followed him to the door. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." "Vaughn," he corrected with a gentle smile. "Welcome back to Silver Creek, Miss Fairfield." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Eliza stood in the doorway watching until his figure disappeared into the gathering darkness. For the first time in a long while, she felt something other than the constant vigilance that had become her companion since that terrible night in Boston, a flicker of something almost like hope. The next morning, Eliza rose early and began the task of cleaning her father's medical practice. The familiar smells of antiseptic and herbs stirred memories of watching him work when she was a child, following him on house calls, and learning the names of bones and remedies long before most children could read. She was sweeping the floor when a knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found a woman holding a young boy whose arm was bent at an unnatural angle. "Are you the doctor now?" the woman asked, her face lined with worry. "My Tommy fell from the hayloft." Eliza hesitated only a moment. "Yes, bring him in." For the next hour, she worked steadily, setting the broken arm, splinting it, and providing the mother with instructions for care. When they left, the boy's pain eased by willow bark tea and his arm properly bandaged, Eliza felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. The day continued with a steady stream of patients: an old miner with a hacking cough, a pregnant woman seeking advice, a cowboy with a nasty cut on his palm. By sunset, exhaustion settled over her, but it was the satisfying kind that came from meaningful work. As she was cleaning her instruments, the door opened again. Vaughn Thornton stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway. "I heard you've been busy," he said, setting a basket on the examination table. "Thought you might not have had time for a proper meal." The aroma of fresh bread and stew filled the room, making her stomach growl embarrassingly. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, too caught up in treating patients. "One of the ranch hands cut himself breaking a new horse," Vaughn continued, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a gash on his forearm. "Thought I'd better have it looked at." Eliza suspected the injury was minor and could have waited, but she appreciated the gesture for what it was: a kindness disguised as a need. "Sit down," she instructed, gathering clean bandages. As she cleaned the wound, her fingers brushed against another scar on his arm, older, a pale line against his sun-darkened skin. "Barbed wire," he explained, noticing her glance. "First year on my own ranch. Was too stubborn to ask for help stringing fence." She nodded, continuing her work. "It was a clean cut today. Should heal well if you keep it clean." "Had plenty worse," he said with a shrug. "Though I suspect you understand that better than most." Her hands stilled for a moment, then continued wrapping the bandage. "What makes you say that?" "The way you carry yourself. Like someone who's known pain but chose to keep going anyway." Eliza finished tying off the bandage, avoiding his gaze. Most people have experienced pain, Mr. Thornton. Vaughn, he corrected again. And yes, that's true. But not everyone uses it to become stronger. She finally met his eyes, searching for mockery, but finding only sincerity. You don't know anything about me. I know you came back to a town that holds difficult memories because people here needed a doctor. I know you've treated everyone who came through that door today with skill and compassion. That tells me enough. Eliza didn't know how to respond. She wasn't accustomed to being seen so clearly or at all. For years, she'd made herself invisible, hiding behind high collars and long sleeves, avoiding eyes that might look too closely. Eat while it's still warm, Vaughn said, nodding toward the basket. Mrs. Colson's stew is famous in these parts. Before she could thank him, another knock came at the door. A frantic father stood there with his teenage daughter, who was struggling to breathe. Diphtheria, Eliza diagnosed after a quick examination. Mr. Thornton, I need hot water and clean towels. Without hesitation, Vaughn moved to help, following her instructions with quiet efficiency as she prepared a steam tent to ease the girl's breathing and mixed medicines from her father's stores. For the next several hours, they worked side by side, Vaughn assisting without being asked as Eliza fought to save the girl's life. Dawn was breaking when the crisis passed, the girl breathing easier at last. Her exhausted father wept with relief when Eliza told him the worst was over. As the man and his daughter settled into the recovery room adjacent to the practice, Eliza sank into her father's desk chair, her own exhaustion finally catching up with her. You're good at this, Vaughn said quietly, handing her a cup of coffee he'd brewed during the night. I had a good teacher, she replied, accepting the cup gratefully. My father, and then the doctors in Boston. Boston, he repeated. Is that where you got those scars you're so careful to hide? The question, asked gently but directly, made her stiffen. The cup trembled slightly in her hand, coffee threatening to spill. I apologize, he said immediately. That was too forward. Yes, it was. Her voice was cold, a defense mechanism honed over years. Vaughn leaned against the desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes serious. My mother used to say scars are just proof we survived something that tried to break us. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. A shadow crossed his face. She had her own scars. My father was not a gentle man. The admission, offered freely, caught Eliza off guard. It was clearly something he didn't share easily, a piece of himself given in exchange for what he'd asked of her. I should get some rest before more patients arrive, she said, not ready to reciprocate the confidence. Vaughn straightened, respecting her withdrawal. Of course. I'll check on the Petersons before I head back to the ranch. At the door, he paused. Miss Fairfield, Eliza, whatever happened in Boston, it doesn't define you here. Not unless you let it. After he left, his words lingered in the quiet office. For 3 years, she'd allowed the scars both visible and invisible to define her entire existence. The thought that it could be different was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Over the next weeks, a routine emerged. Eliza treated patients during the day, sometimes riding out to distant farms and ranches when needed. Vaughn appeared regularly, sometimes with legitimate medical concerns for his ranch hands, sometimes with transparent excuses to check on her. Each time, he brought food or supplies, staying to talk if she wasn't busy. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the walls Eliza had built began to crumble. She found herself looking forward to his visits, enjoying his dry humor and the stories he told of ranch life. He never again directly mentioned her scars, but his eyes sometimes lingered on her throat when her collar shifted, not with disgust, but with a quiet acceptance that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. One evening in early October, Vaughn arrived as she was closing up for the day. I brought you something, he said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal. I noticed you writing notes about your patients on scraps of paper, he explained. Thought you might like something proper to keep them in. It's beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the soft leather. Thank you. I was hoping you might join me for dinner tonight, he continued. Not here at my ranch. I've been talking about it for weeks. Thought you might like to see it. The invitation caught her by surprise. It was one thing to talk in the safety of her practice, another entirely to enter his personal space, to be alone with him in a social context. I don't know if that's appropriate, she hedged. I've invited Mrs. Peterson and her daughter as well, he assured her. They're bringing one of those apple pies you mentioned liking. The consideration behind the gesture ensuring her reputation wouldn't be compromised while still creating an opportunity for them to spend time together touched her. In that case, I'd be delighted. That evening, riding beside Vaughn in his wagon with Mrs. Peterson and her 18-year-old daughter chatting happily in the back, Eliza felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and crimson, the aspens along the creek already turning bright yellow with the changing season. The Triple T Ranch was impressive, a large main house built of sturdy logs, several outbuildings, corrals filled with fine horses, and cattle grazing on the hillsides. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work. You've built all this yourself? She asked as he helped her down from the wagon. Started with 20 acres and a leaky cabin, he said, pride evident in his voice. Now it's 2,000 acres and 15 men on payroll. Dinner was a pleasant affair. Mrs. Peterson and her daughter provided comfortable conversation, and Vaughn proved to be an excellent host. Afterward, while the Petersons helped his housekeeper with the dishes despite his protests, Vaughn invited Eliza to see the view from the porch. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, the air crisp with the promise of winter not far off. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, shoulders almost touching as they leaned against the railing. When I first came west, I'd never seen stars like this, Vaughn said. Made me feel small and large at the same time, insignificant in the face of so much vastness, but part of something magnificent too. Eliza glanced at his profile, struck by the poetry of his words. You don't fit the stereotype of the rugged, uncomplicated cowboy, do you? He laughed softly. Don't tell my men. They prefer thinking of me as the tough boss who doesn't know Shakespeare from a branding iron. But you do know Shakespeare? My mother was a schoolteacher before she married. She made sure I read the classics, even when my father said it was a waste for a boy who'd just be working cattle. The mention of his father darkened his expression momentarily. Eliza found herself wanting to comfort him, to know more about the pain he carried. What happened to them? Your parents? Vaughn was quiet for a long moment. My father died in a bar fight when I was 16. My mother passed 2 years later, consumption, the doctor said, but I think it was really a broken heart. She'd endured so much for so long, and when he was gone, she just faded. I'm sorry, Eliza said softly. That must have been difficult. It was, but it taught me something important. He turned to face her fully. Life can be cruel, Eliza, but it can also be beautiful beyond measure. Sometimes those things exist side by side. His gaze was intense, searching. Eliza felt exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. Yet for the first time in years, that feeling didn't terrify her. In Boston, she began, the words coming unexpectedly even to herself. I was teaching at a small school while studying medicine in the evenings. One night, walking home, I was attacked. Vaughn remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged except for a slight tightening around his eyes. He had a knife, she continued, her voice growing quieter. When I fought back, he cut me. Here. She touched her neck where the scar began. And here. Her hand moved to her ribs, then her arm. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. You were brave, Vaughn said, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head. I was terrified. I still am, sometimes. After it happened, I couldn't bear for anyone to see the scars. They reminded me of being helpless, of almost dying in a dirty alley because a man decided he had the right to take what he wanted. That's why you wear high collars and long sleeves, even in August heat. Yes, I can't stand the looks of pity, or worse, disgust. Vaughn's hand moved slowly toward hers, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he took her hand gently. Those scars are proof of your courage, Eliza. They show you fought back, that you survived. A tear slipped down her cheek. That's what my father said in his letters, but I couldn't believe him. I was so angry at the man who attacked me, at myself for being vulnerable, at a world where such things happen. Anger keeps us alive sometimes, Vaughn said. But eventually, it can become another prison. Is that why you left wherever you came from? To escape a prison of your own? A small smile curved his lips. Perhaps we recognize in each other what we've both tried to overcome. The sound of the door opening broke the moment. Mrs. Peterson and her daughter emerged, thanking Vaughn for the lovely evening. The ride back to town was filled with the older woman's cheerful chatter, but Eliza was aware of Vaughn beside her, of the warmth of his arm occasionally brushing hers as the wagon moved along the rutted road. When they reached her home, Vaughn walked her to the door after ensuring the Petersons were safely delivered to their own house. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, standing closer than propriety might dictate. "Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed seeing your ranch. I'd like to see you again, not as a patient or a doctor, but as a man calling on a woman he admires greatly." The directness of his words both thrilled and frightened her. "Vaughn, I'm not. I don't know if I can be what you might want. All I want is the chance to know you better," he said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less. You set the pace." Eliza studied his face in the moonlight, the strong lines of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the scar that marked his own history of survival. "I'd like that," she said finally. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Then I'll call on you properly. Sunday after church?" "Sunday," she agreed. That night, alone in her father's house that was slowly becoming her own, Eliza stood before the mirror and, for the first time in 3 years, deliberately looked at her scars. The jagged line along her collarbone, the smaller marks on her arm, the longer one that curved around her ribs. They were part of her now, mapped onto her skin like rivers on a landscape. "Proof of survival," she whispered, testing Vaughn's words, her father's words, feeling them settle into her consciousness with new weight. Winter came early that year, blanketing Silver Creek in snow by early November. Eliza's practice thrived as words spread of her skill and compassion. Vaughn courted her with a patient determination that never pressured but never wavered. Sunday dinners, rides when the weather permitted, books left on her doorstep with thoughtful notes tucked between the pages. As Christmas approached, a brutal snowstorm isolated the town for nearly a week. When the roads finally cleared enough for travel, Vaughn appeared at her door, his face drawn with worry. "I was concerned when no one could get through from town," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though I was running low on firewood. "I brought some," he said, nodding toward his wagon. "And supplies. The general store was worried about you out here alone." As they unloaded the wagon, working together in comfortable rhythm, Eliza realized how much had changed in the months since her return. She no longer flinched when Vaughn's hand brushed hers. She no longer felt the need to ensure her collar was perfectly in place around him. Somewhere along the way, she'd begun to trust him not just with her safety, but with her vulnerability. That evening, after they'd stoked the fire and shared a simple meal, they sat side by side on the small sofa. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent curtains, cocooning the house in a world of white. "I have something for you," Vaughn said, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He handed her a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a silver locket, simple but beautifully crafted. "Open it," he urged when she looked at him questioningly. Inside was a tiny folded paper. She carefully extracted it and unfolded it to find a message in his strong handwriting. "To Eliza, whose courage inspires me daily. With love, Vaughn." "With love," she read aloud, her voice catching. "Yes," he said simply. "I love you, Eliza. I have for months now." She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by emotions she'd kept carefully controlled for so long. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, but of feeling so much." "I know." His hand covered hers, warm and steady. "But I've seen you face fear before. You're the bravest person I know." Eliza opened her eyes to find him watching her with such tenderness that it stole her breath. "I love you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating. Vaughn's smile was brilliant. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't, he kissed her gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I want to spend my life with you, Eliza. Not today, not tomorrow, but when you're ready. I'll wait as long as you need." She touched his face, tracing the scar along his jaw. "I don't think I need to wait very long at all." In the weeks that followed, as winter held the land in its icy grip, Eliza found herself thawing from the inside out. The wall she'd built around her heart crumbled a little more each day in the face of Vaughn's steady love. One night in February, as they sat before the fire in her home, Eliza made a decision. Without speaking, she began to unbutton the high collar of her dress, exposing the full length of the scar that ran from her collarbone down toward her breast. Vaughn watched her, his expression solemn. When she finished, her hands trembling slightly, he moved to kneel before her. "May I?" he asked, his voice husky. At her nod, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to the beginning of the scar, a kiss as reverent as a prayer. "Beautiful," he murmured against her skin. "Because it's part of you. Because it means you survived." Tears filled her eyes as he continued, kissing each scar with tender devotion, the one on her arm, the one at her ribs when she guided his hand beneath her partially open dress. "Each one is proof of your strength," he said between kisses. "Each one brought you here, to me. How could I not love them?" That night, for the first time, Eliza gave herself completely to Vaughn, allowing him to see all of her scars, to kiss each one, to show her that she was not diminished by them, but made more precious, more extraordinary. They were married in the spring, when the wildflowers carpeted the plains around Silver Creek in a riot of color. The entire town attended the wedding of their doctor and the respected rancher who'd won her heart. Eliza wore a dress with a lower neckline than she'd chosen in years, the edge of her scar visible above the lace. When her husband kissed her before the assembled townspeople, his hand gently caressing the mark on her neck, she felt no shame, only pride in having survived, in having found the courage to love again. As they rode toward the Triple T Ranch, now their shared home, Vaughn pulled his horse alongside hers. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "Your father would be proud of you, of the doctor you've become, of the woman you are." Eliza smiled, feeling the warm spring sun on her face. "I think he would be, and I think he would have loved you. Because I love his daughter? Because you helped me remember what he always tried to teach me, that scars are not something to hide, but something to honor. Proof that we can endure, that we can heal, that we can love again," Vaughn added, reaching across to take her hand. As they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, their ranch now, Eliza felt a sense of peace settle over her. The scars would always be there, marks upon her skin telling the story of her worst day. But they no longer defined her. What defined her now was the work she did healing others, the community she'd rejoined, and the love she shared with the man beside her who had taught her to see her scars as he did, not as flaws, but as proof of survival. And in the years that followed, through the birth of their children, through hardships and joys, through all the complexities of building a life together, that remained their shared truth, that the marks life leaves upon us are not our ending, but merely chapters in a story still being written. A story of survival, of healing, and most of all, of love.